The air inside Ethelgard was not merely air. It was a curated atmosphere, a meticulously crafted blend of old money, French perfume, and the faintest, most decadent scent of black truffles shaved over handmade pasta. It was a substance too heavy for the common lung, thick with unspoken agreements and billion-dollar handshakes. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, not like light fixtures, but like frozen constellations, their refracted light scattering across polished marble floors and the deep, rich mahogany of the walls. The soundscape was a symphony of restraint, the delicate, almost musical clink of silver cutlery on porcelain, the hushed murmur of powerful voices discussing mergers and acquisitions, and the near-silent footsteps of the staff who moved through the space like phantoms in crisp, black uniforms. They were trained to be invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to exist as extensions of the restaurant's flawless ambiance. Ilara Vance was more than just part of this machine. She was one of its most polished, most invisible components. Her movements were a study in practiced grace, each step measured, each gesture economical. Her face a mask of serene professionalism that betrayed nothing of the universe of knowledge and fury that churned within her. Beneath the starched collar of her uniform, Ilara lived a life of stark, brutal contrast. Here, she poured vintage Bordeaux into glasses that cost more than her monthly rent, serving men who could buy and sell the world without a second thought. But in her mind, she was miles away, in a small, dimly lit apartment that smelled of antiseptic and boiled vegetables. The image of her father was seared onto the inside of her eyelids, a constant, flickering presence. She saw him propped against a mountain of pillows, his once powerful chest, broad from decades of work in the mines, now a fragile cage that struggled with every breath. The sound she heard was not the gentle pop of a champagne cork, but the wet, rattling cough that shook his entire body, a sound that was the soundtrack to her every waking moment. He was the reason she was here, the motivation behind every deferential nod and every forced, polite smile. Every dollar she earned, every demeaning comment she absorbed, was fuel. It was a down payment on another week of oxygen tanks, another dose of experimental medication, another sliver of hope in the face of a slow, suffocating injustice. Her past life, the one filled with geological survey maps, mass spectrometers, and the thrill of academic discovery, felt like a dream belonging to someone else. The delicate equilibrium of the evening was shattered not by a sound, but by a presence. A shift in the room's gravitational pull announced the arrival of Alistair Finch before his name was ever spoken. He moved not like a guest but like a conquering general entering a city that had already surrendered. His suit was a masterpiece of bespoke tailoring, a dark armor that seemed to absorb the light around him, and his every gesture was imbued with an effortless, almost violent sense of entitlement. He did not walk, he strode. He did not speak to the maitre d', he issued a decree. Beside him, a small girl with wide, curious eyes trailed in his wake, a tiny satellite caught in the orbit of a massive, indifferent planet. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community for more stories where justice is served. Ilara was assigned to his table. It was an inevitability, a cosmic joke of the highest order. She had known this day might come. Finch Global Mining was a name she had whispered to herself in the dark, a curse she had written in the margins of her father's medical bills. Now the architect of her family's ruin sat before her, complaining that the water was not chilled to his precise specification. She watched him, her face a perfect blank canvas. He treated the staff not as human beings, but as functional, often malfunctioning, pieces of equipment. He dismissed the sommelier with a contemptuous flick of his wrist, his eyes never once leaving the stock market ticker on his phone. He exuded a kind of profound, soul-deep arrogance that poisoned the very air around him, a belief so absolute in his own superiority that it rendered everyone else insignificant. His daughter, meanwhile, sat quietly, ignored by her father, her small hands busy with a secret treasure she had pulled from the pockets of her dress. On the pristine white linen tablecloth, a stark contrast to the gold-rimmed plates and sparkling crystal, the little girl had arranged a small collection of rocks. They were humble things, the kind a child might find in a park or along a gravel path. One was a smooth, dark gray stone, worn by time and water. Another was a piece of ordinary-looking quartz, milky and opaque. But a third was different. It was a dull, unassuming little stone, yet it held a faint, almost imperceptible vein of greenish blue that seemed to capture the light in a peculiar way. Yalara's eyes, trained to see the secrets held within the earth, caught the detail instantly. A flicker of her old life, a ghost of the geology prodigy she once was, stirred within her. For a fleeting moment, she felt a pang of connection with the small, forgotten girl, a shared appreciation for the quiet, hidden beauty of the world. It was a moment of pure, innocent wonder in a room suffocated by calculated power. The moment was shattered by Finch's voice. It was not loud, but it had a serrated edge that cut through the restaurant's decorum with brutal efficiency. He had finally noticed his daughter's little display, and his face contorted into a mask of theatrical disgust. He did not address the child. Instead, he snapped his fingers in Alara's direction, a gesture of a master summoning a servant. His eyes, when they finally landed on her, were filled with a cold, dismissive fire. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the small stones. He accused her of dereliction of duty, of allowing his table to be cluttered with what he called dirty, dumb rocks from the gutter. He spoke as if she were personally responsible for this offense against his aesthetic sensibilities, this intrusion of the common and the worthless into his gilded sanctuary. The words were designed to sting, to remind her of her place, to assert his dominance in the most casual and cruel way imaginable. As he spoke, something inside Alara began to shift. The professional mask she wore so carefully did not crack, but the foundation beneath it trembled. His words, dripping with disdain, were not just about the rocks. They were about her. They were about her father. They were about an entire class of people he deemed disposable. The word dumb echoed in the chambers of her memory, intertwining with the sterile hum of her father's oxygen concentrator. A cold fury, different from the hot, helpless anger she usually felt, began to solidify in her veins. It was a geologist's fury, patient and immense, born of pressure and time. The image of her father's face, pale and gaunt, flashed in her mind, his labored breathing a silent scream against the injustice of it all. Finch saw a waitress, but that waitress was the daughter of a man he had condemned to a slow death for the sake of a few percentage points on a quarterly report. He had no idea of the geological fault line he was standing on, no concept of the tectonic forces he was currently provoking with his careless, arrogant words. The public humiliation intensified. Finch, now performing for his investor, raised his voice slightly, ensuring the nearby tables could hear his magnanimous correction of this lowly server. He gestured expansively with his hand, a caricature of a benevolent ruler educating a peasant. He wanted everyone to witness his power, his discerning taste, his intolerance for anything less than perfection. The other diners shifted uncomfortably, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. The restaurant manager began to drift towards the table, his face pale with anxiety, desperate to placate his most valuable customer. The air grew thick with tension. Finch leaned forward, a smug, predatory smile playing on his lips, and delivered the final, fatal blow. He looked directly into Alara's eyes, his own filled with a vacuous certainty, and asked the question that would seal his fate. "What?" he mused aloud, his voice a silken weapon. "Could someone like you possibly know about value?" For a long moment, there was only silence. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Alara stood perfectly still, absorbing the insult, letting it wash over her. The hurt, the shame, the years of repressed rage. They were all there, but they were no longer in control. Something else was taking over. A profound, icy calm settled over her, the kind of clarity that comes only in the eye of a hurricane. Her training, her education, the thousands of hours spent studying crystalline structures and mineral compositions, all of it rushed to the forefront of her mind. A sleeping giant awakened. Her gaze dropped from Finch's arrogant face to the small, unassuming stone on the table, the one with the faint bluish-green vein. She no longer saw a child's trinket. She saw a chemical formula. She saw a unique lattice structure. She saw a story written over millions of years, a secret the Earth had kept hidden until now. The waitress receded, and the scientist emerged. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head, and her eyes, no longer deferential or invisible, met Alistair Finch's. They were not the eyes of a servant, they were the eyes of an expert, and in them he could have seen his entire world about to be undone. Alistair Finch's question about value hung in the air, a toxic cloud of arrogance that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room. But for Ilara, it was not a cloud, it was a clarifying agent. In that single, suspended moment, the years of quiet servitude, of biting her tongue until it bled, of smiling through gritted teeth, while men like him decided the fate of the world over cognac and cigars, all of it coalesced into a single point of crystalline focus. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses and the murmur of distant conversations, faded into an indistinct hum, as if she were submerged deep underwater. The only thing that remained sharp and clear was the small, unassuming stone on the white tablecloth. Her posture, which had been a study in self-effacement, underwent a transformation so subtle yet so profound that it was almost tectonic. Her shoulders, previously curved in a posture of deference, squared themselves with an invisible click. Her chin, which had been perpetually dipped in a gesture of polite attention, lifted slowly, deliberately, until her gaze was level with his. The professional mask did not fall away, it was chiseled away from within, revealing a countenance of absolute, unnerving serenity. Her hands, which had been held primly behind her back, moved with a fluid, unhurried grace, as if she were in her own laboratory, not the lion's den. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was unrecognizable. The soft, accommodating tone of a waitress was gone, replaced by something else entirely. It was a voice of quiet authority, measured and precise, with the resonant clarity of a lecture hall professor addressing a captivated audience. It held no anger, no resentment, only the cold, hard weight of irrefutable fact. She did not answer his question directly. She dismissed it as irrelevant, the query of an amateur. Instead, her fingers, long and delicate, gently picked up the little stone with the greenish-blue vein, cradling it in her palm with the reverence of a curator handling a priceless artifact. The gesture itself was a rebuke, a silent statement that he was not qualified to even understand the question he was asking. She turned the stone over, her thumb tracing the unique inclusion that ran through its core, her eyes cataloging every facet, every flaw, every secret held within its million-year-old heart. The entire room seemed to lean in, drawn by the sudden, inexplicable shift in the balance of power. The hunter had, in the blink of an eye, become the observed. "This," she began, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "is not a dumb rock." Her eyes finally lifted from the stone and met Finch's, and for the first time, he saw not a servant but an equal, and it shook him to his core. "This is a raw, uncut specimen of a previously unclassified borosilicate mineral, likely a new cryptocrystalline variety of Elbe tourmaline, though its pleochroism is unlike any recorded variant. Its specific gravity, which I would estimate at approximately 3.08, and its distinct vitreous luster suggest a high concentration of copper and manganese ions, which would account for the unusual bluish-green chromatic shift under direct light." The words flowed from her not as a memorized speech, but as a natural extension of her being, the language of her soul. She spoke of trigonal crystal systems and botryoidal aggregates, of fracture patterns and refractive indices, weaving a tapestry of scientific terminology that was as beautiful as it was devastating. She was no longer a waitress, she was an educator, and Alistair Finch's opulent dining table had just become her classroom, a stage for a lesson he would never forget. The investor seated next to Finch, a man named Marcus Thorne who dealt in rare earth minerals and understood the language of assets, shifted in his seat. His initial boredom had evaporated, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed not on Finch, but on the stone in Ilara's hand, and then on Ilara herself. He recognized the sound of genuine expertise when he heard it, a currency far more reliable than the blustering bravado of men like Finch. Thorne saw the potential for profit, a new frontier in a market he thought he had mastered. He saw a discovery. Alistair Finch, on the other hand, saw only his own reflection in the suddenly intelligent eyes of his waitress, and it was the image of a fool. His face, which had been a mask of smug superiority, began to crumble. A dark flush crept up his neck, a tide of pure, undiluted humiliation. He tried to form a witty retort, a dismissive comment, but his mind, so adept at corporate warfare and hostile takeovers, was utterly blank. He had no weapons for this kind of fight, a battle of intellect and knowledge. He had walked onto a battlefield of his own making, only to find himself completely and utterly outmatched. "You asked me about value, Mr. Finch," Ilara continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the silent room. "A stone like this, once it is cut and its provenance is established, particularly as a new classification bearing the name of its discoverer, would not be valued in mere dollars. Its value would be geological, historical. It would rewrite a small portion of what we know about pegmatite formations in this region. However, for the sake of your limited frame of reference, let's talk about the market. A find of this purity and unique coloration could fetch anywhere between $50,000 and $75,000 per carat on the open market. Given its estimated weight, this little rock your daughter found in the gutter is likely worth more than your car, your suit, and the education of the man you are trying to impress combined." She placed the stone gently back on the table, next to the little girl's water glass, a silent offering. Then, she straightened up, her work done, her expression unreadable. The silence that followed was deafening, a vacuum where Alistair Finch's authority used to be. The spell was broken by the sound of a chair scraping violently against the marble floor. Alistair Finch shot to his feet, his face a grotesque mask of fury. The carefully constructed facade of the untouchable billionaire had been shattered into 1,000 pieces, and all that was left was raw, sputtering rage. The blood pounded in his ears, a roaring inferno of wounded pride. He was not just embarrassed, he had been intellectually gutted, exposed as a hollow man in front of an important business partner. He pointed a trembling finger at Ilara, his voice a ragged, strangled thing. "You're fired," he spat, the words clumsy and brutish. "Get her out of here. Now." It was the only weapon he had left in his arsenal, the crude, blunt instrument of power. He could not win the argument, so he would simply destroy the arguer. He would erase her from his sight, banish her from his world, and pretend this moment of utter annihilation had never happened. It was the desperate act of a king whose crown had just been revealed to be made of paper. The restaurant manager, a man named Julian, who prided himself on his ability to handle any crisis with smooth, invisible efficiency, scurried to the table. His face was ashen, his professional smile frozen in a rictus of terror. He saw the situation not in terms of right and wrong, but in terms of revenue. Alistair Finch spent more at Æthelgard in a month than Ilara earned in a year. The calculation was simple, brutal, and immediate. He turned to Ilara, his eyes pleading with her to not make this any more difficult than it had to be. He avoided looking at Finch, as if the man's rage were a physical force that could scorch him. Julian's world was built on a delicate ecosystem of appeasement, and a predator was roaring in the heart of it. He needed to make a sacrifice, and the choice was obvious. The system was designed to protect the powerful, and Ilara, for all her brilliance, was utterly completely powerless in this moment. He had to sever the limb to save the body. "Miss Vance," Julian said, his voice barely a whisper, his words tasting like ash in his own mouth. "Please, gather your things. We will have your final check ready at the front." He refused to meet her eyes, focusing instead on a point on the wall just over her shoulder. He was a coward, and he knew it, but his cowardice was a survival mechanism in this world of gilded cages and unforgiving patrons. He was just another cog in the machine that Finch owned, a machine designed to chew up people like Ilara and spit them out. Ilara simply nodded, a single, sharp gesture of acceptance. There was nothing left to say. She had drawn her sword, struck a fatal blow, and now she had to accept the consequences. She turned, without another glance at the man whose life she had just upended, and walked away from the table. The journey across the dining room felt like a mile, each step a testament to her public execution. She could feel the stares of the other diners on her back, a mixture of pity, awe, and morbid curiosity. They had witnessed a spectacular fall from grace, but it was not hers. As she passed the maitre d's station, a young man handed her a slim envelope containing her final wages, his face a mask of genuine sympathy. She took it without a word, her movements calm and composed. She did not allow a single tear to fall, not a single tremor to betray the storm that was gathering inside her. She walked through the heavy oak doors of Ethelgard and out into the cold New York night. The sudden shock of the frigid air was a slap in the face, a brutal welcome back to reality. The city lights, usually a source of wonder, seemed to mock her, a million glittering eyes indifferent to her plight. The opulent world of the restaurant, with its warmth and its scent of truffles and old money, was gone. The door shut firmly behind her. She was once again on the outside, looking in. But this time she was not just invisible. She was exiled, cast out for the crime of being brilliant. The full weight of what had just happened crashed down on her, not as a wave of anger, but as a cold, sickening dread. It was a physical sensation, a knot of ice forming in the pit of her stomach. This job, this demeaning, soul-crushing job, was more than just a source of income. It was her father's lifeline. It was the money for the oxygen tanks that sat by his bed, hissing a steady rhythm of life. It was the co-payment for the experimental drugs that kept the fluid from filling his lungs completely. It was the rent for their small, cramped apartment, the only home he had known for the past 30 years. Every deferential nod, every swallowed insult, had been a transaction, trading a piece of her dignity for another day of his life. And now, in a single blaze of righteous intellectual pride, she had burned that bridge. The fear was sharp and metallic in her mouth, the taste of utter panic. What had she done? The subway ride home was a blur of screeching brakes and flickering fluorescent lights. She sat huddled in a corner, the thin envelope clutched in her hand, her knuckles white. The faces of the other passengers were tired, anonymous masks, each person locked in their own private struggle. She felt a profound sense of isolation, a feeling that she was adrift in a vast, uncaring ocean. Her mind replayed the scene over and over, not with triumph, but with a growing sense of horror at her own recklessness. The satisfaction of seeing Finch's face crumble was a fleeting warmth, now extinguished by the cold reality of her unemployment. She had won the battle, a spectacular, unforgettable victory of wits over wealth. But in doing so, she had lost the war for her father's survival. The weight of that potential failure was a physical burden, pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She let herself into the apartment, the familiar smell of antiseptic and boiled cabbage, a stark, painful contrast to the perfumed air of Ethelgard. The small space was quiet, save for the gentle, rhythmic puffing of the oxygen concentrator in the corner of the living room, a sound that was both a comfort and a constant reminder of their precarious situation. Her father was asleep in his armchair, a worn blanket pulled up to his chin. His face, illuminated by the soft glow of a single lamp, looked impossibly fragile, the skin stretched thin over his cheekbones. His breathing was shallow, a faint rasp with every exhalation. Seeing him like this, so vulnerable, so dependent on the very job she had just lost, shattered the last of her composure. The cold fury that had sustained her through the confrontation at the restaurant dissolved, leaving behind a raw, aching grief. She felt like a failure, a daughter who had let her pride get in the way of her most sacred duty. She sank onto the worn sofa across from him, the springs groaning in protest. The tears she had refused to shed in public now streamed down her face, hot and silent. They were tears of fear, of regret, of a deep, soul-crushing helplessness. She had stood up to a tyrant, she had spoken truth to power, but what good was it now? What good was her brilliant mind if it couldn't keep the lights on or the oxygen flowing? For a long, dark hour, she allowed herself to drown in despair. She saw a future of eviction notices, of hushed, apologetic calls from the medical supply company, of her father's health declining rapidly without the proper care. The world felt like a cruel, rigged game, one where the Alistair Finches of the world always held the winning hand, free to discard human lives like worthless cards. She felt small and insignificant, a piece of dust in the face of an indifferent universe. But as the hours crept by and the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the grimy apartment window, something began to shift inside her once more. The despair did not vanish, but it began to recede, burned away by the slow, returning heat of her anger. She looked at her sleeping father, at the lines of pain etched around his mouth even in slumber, and she remembered the cause of his suffering. It wasn't just a random illness. It was a crime. A deliberate act of negligence signed off by the very man who had mocked her hours earlier. Alistair Finch. The name was a curse, a brand on her family's soul. He had not just cost her a job tonight. He had cost her father his health, his future, his life. He had cost her a promising career, forcing her into the shadows, into a life of servitude. He had taken everything, and he had done it with the casual indifference of a man swatting a fly. A new kind of resolve, harder and colder than anything she had ever felt before, began to solidify in her veins. This was no longer about survival. Survival was a passive state, a reaction to the world. This had to be about justice. Justice was an action, a deliberate pursuit. The humiliation she had inflicted upon Finch at the restaurant was not the end of the story, it was the beginning. It was the first shot fired in a war he didn't even know he was fighting. He thought he had fired a waitress. He had no idea he had just activated a scientist. He had underestimated her, and that was his fatal error. He saw her as a disposable pawn on his chessboard, but he had failed to realize that this pawn knew the entire game, and she was about to start playing by her own rules. Her grief and fear were not weaknesses. They were fuel, and she had a furnace of intellect ready to burn it. She stood up, her movements now filled with a newfound purpose. The tears had stopped, and her eyes were clear and focused. She walked over to a stack of dusty boxes piled in a corner, boxes she hadn't touched in years. They contained the remnants of her former life. Textbooks on mineralogy, geological survey maps, her notes from doctoral seminars, her half-finished dissertation. It was a painful archive of a future that had been stolen from her. She rummaged through one of the boxes until her fingers found what she was looking for: a worn, leather-bound address book. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation, until she found the entry she sought. Professor Alistair Davies, her mentor, the man who had once called her the most gifted geologist he had ever taught. She stared at the phone number for a long moment, the digits seeming to pulse with the weight of her decision. Making this call was an admission of defeat on one level, a cry for help. But it was also an act of defiance. It was a refusal to remain silent and broken. It was the first step in reclaiming her own identity, not as a waitress, but as the expert she was always meant to be. Her hand was steady as she picked up her phone and dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, each ring stretching into an eternity. She almost hung up, her nerve failing her. But then a familiar voice, slightly older and more gravelly than she remembered, answered on the other end. a voice of academia, of reason, of a world she thought she had lost forever. "Professor Davies, it's Alara Vance." Her voice was steady, but she could hear the faint tremor of emotion beneath the surface. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a moment of recognition followed by genuine warmth. "Alara, my dear girl, it's been years. How are you?" The simple, kind question almost broke her again, but she held herself together. She took a deep breath and began to speak, the words tumbling out of her in a rush. She told him everything. She told him about her father, about the mines, about the waitressing job. And then she told him about Alistair Finch, about the little girl, and about the dumb rock that was anything but. She described the stone in excruciating, technical detail, her scientific vocabulary flowing effortlessly, a testament to the knowledge that had been lying dormant within her for so long. She expected skepticism, perhaps even pity. What she heard instead was a growing excitement in her old mentor's voice. As she detailed the stone's unique properties, she could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. He asked sharp, specific questions about its pleochroism and crystalline habit, his initial concern for a former student transforming into the focused curiosity of a fellow scientist on the verge of a discovery. He recognized the truth in her analysis, the undeniable signature of her once prodigious talent. An unclassified borosilicate with that level of copper saturation, he murmured, more to himself than to her. "My God, Alara, if you're right, this is significant." It was the validation she desperately needed, a confirmation that she was not crazy, that her knowledge was still real, still powerful. Then she delivered the final piece of the puzzle, the piece that would transform this from a fascinating geological curiosity into a crusade. "The man at the table, the one who had me fired, his name is Alistair Finch, CEO of Finch Global Mining." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Professor Davies knew the name well. Finch was a pariah in the academic and ethical mining communities, a corporate vulture known for his predatory practices and his complete disregard for environmental and human costs. His reputation was a stain on their entire industry. "And that's the company," Alara said, her voice dropping, her words heavy with the weight of years of pain. "That's the company that bought the Blackwood Creek mine. The one where my father worked, the one that poisoned him." The silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of shock, but of understanding. All the pieces clicked into place, forming a dark, ugly picture of corporate greed and human tragedy. Professor Davies was no longer just an academic. He was a witness to a confession, a call to arms. He understood that Alara had not just stumbled upon a new gemstone. She had stumbled upon an opportunity for a reckoning that was long overdue. The world of geology was small, and the stories of Finch's ruthlessness were legendary, but they had always remained whispers, rumors without a face, without a victim willing and able to fight back. Until now, he had picked a fight with the wrong person. He had tried to silence a voice that knew not only the value of stones, but the cost of human lives. "We are going to help you, Alara," Professor Davies said, his voice now firm, filled with a conviction that sent a surge of strength through her. "First, we need to get our hands on that stone. We need to verify your analysis, get it certified. That will be our key. It will give you a platform. It will restore your credibility in a way no one can dispute. You will no longer be a waitress they can dismiss. You will be the discoverer of a new gem, an expert in your field." His mind was already working, formulating a strategy, seeing the path forward through the fog. He knew people, influential people who despised Finch and his methods. He knew journalists who specialized in corporate malfeasance, and he knew ethical investors who were looking for a reason to challenge Finch's stranglehold on the market. The plan began to take shape over the phone line, a blueprint for justice drawn in the early morning light. The gemstone was the Trojan horse. They would use the excitement and publicity around its discovery to get Alara into the rooms Finch thought were impenetrable. She would be invited to speak at geological conferences, interviewed by industry publications, consulted by gemological institutes. And once she was inside, once she had their attention, she would pivot. She would tell them another story, not about the value of a rare stone, but about the cost of a common one, coal. She would tell them the story of her father, and of the dozens of other men who were sacrificed for a profit margin. She would use her scientific precision to dismantle Finch's empire, piece by piece, memo by memo, crime by crime. By the time Ilara hung up the phone, the sun was fully risen, casting long shadows across her small apartment. But for the first time in years, she did not feel like she was living in the shadows herself. The fear had not disappeared, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, clarifying sense of purpose. She looked over at her father, still sleeping peacefully, the rhythm of the oxygen machine, a steady beat in the quiet room. She was no longer just his caregiver, a passive victim of circumstance. She was his champion. She was a scientist on the verge of her greatest discovery, and a daughter on the cusp of avenging her father. The game was afoot. Alistair Finch had taken her job, her career, and her father's health. Now she was going to take everything from him. The hunt had officially begun. The first step was to secure the asset. Professor Davies had been unequivocal on the phone. Without the stone, their story was merely an anecdote, a tale of a clever waitress who had a good day. With the stone, it became a discovery, a verifiable scientific event that would grant Ilara a platform built on unimpeachable fact. The challenge, however, was immense. The stone was still at Æthelgard, a silent witness on a table that was now a crime scene of social assassination. Returning to the restaurant was impossible, an act of walking back into the lion's den after having successfully pulled its teeth. Her mind raced through a dozen impossible scenarios, each more dangerous than the last. She imagined trying to sneak in, trying to bribe a former coworker, but the risks were too great. The solution came not from a place of cunning, but from a place of simple, overlooked humanity. It was the little girl, Alistair Finch's daughter, who held the key. Ilara remembered the way the child had looked at her collection, with a quiet reverence that her father could never comprehend. The girl would not have abandoned her treasures. Acting on a desperate hunch, Ilara found the public contact number for Finch Global Mining's corporate headquarters. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she navigated the automated phone tree. Her voice, when she finally reached a human assistant, carefully modulated to sound professional and unassuming. She identified herself not as a fired waitress, but as a representative from the Æthelgard restaurant's lost and found department. She explained in a tone of polite efficiency that a young guest had left behind a small collection of sentimental items, specifically some stones, and that the restaurant wished to ensure their safe return. The lie was audacious, a tightrope walk over a canyon of failure, but it was delivered with such bureaucratic sincerity that it was never questioned. An address was provided, a courier was arranged, and less than 24 hours later, a small, padded envelope arrived at Professor Davies's university office. Inside, nestled in a bed of bubble wrap, was the small, unassuming rock with the vein of impossible blue-green. It was the first victory, a small but crucial reclaiming of power, won, not with force, but with the quiet intelligence Finch had so arrogantly dismissed. The geology lab at the university was Ilara's true sanctuary. The moment she stepped through the doors, the familiar scent of old paper, ozone from the electronic equipment, and the faint, dusty smell of rock samples washed over her, a homecoming for a part of her soul she thought had died. Here, she was not a servant, she was a scientist. The years of forced dormancy fell away like a shed skin. Professor Davies watched, a proud, almost paternal smile on his face, as she moved with an innate confidence, her hands sure and steady as she prepared the sample for the spectroscope. She was a virtuoso returning to her instrument. The hum of the machinery was a symphony to her ears, a stark contrast to the clatter of plates and the hiss of her father's oxygen tank. For hours they worked in a state of shared, focused intensity. the world outside the lab walls ceasing to exist. They were explorers charting an unknown territory, their only guide the language of light and crystal, a language Alara spoke with the fluency of a native. The data that began to scroll across the monitor was more than just numbers. It was a confirmation, a vindication, a declaration of truth written in the elemental signature of the universe itself. The results were even more spectacular than her initial field assessment had suggested. The concentration of copper was off the charts, but it was bonded within the silicate lattice in a way that defied established models, creating a pleochroic effect that was utterly unique. It shifted from a deep lagoon blue to a vibrant electric green depending on the angle of the polarized light, a phenomenon never before documented in any tourmaline variant. Professor Davies, a man who had dedicated 40 years of his life to the study of minerals, could only shake his head in quiet awe. He named it, without a moment's hesitation, Vancite, in her honor. The name felt strange and powerful on Alara's tongue. It was a reclaiming of her identity, a permanent etching of her name into the annals of science, a legacy that could never be fired or dismissed. The stone was no longer just a weapon against Finch, it was a monument to her own resilience, a testament to the fact that they could take her job and her career, but they could not take her knowledge. It was the one thing that was truly, unshakably hers. With the analysis certified and the formal discovery paper drafted, Professor Davies made the call that would open the second front of their war. He reached out to Ben Carter, a journalist for a small but fiercely independent online publication that specialized in long-form investigative pieces on corporate crime. Carter was a throwback, a grizzled, cynical newsman who ran on stale coffee and a burning hatred for corporate malfeasance. He had a reputation for being relentless and incorruptible, and he had a particular, long-standing interest in the predatory practices of Alistair Finch. When Davies explained the situation, Carter was intrigued by the story of the gemstone, but his interest turned into a predatory focus when he heard the name Alara Vance connected to the Blackwood Creek mine. He had tried to investigate Finch's acquisition of that mine years ago, but had hit a wall of sealed records and non-disclosure agreements. He saw Alara not just as a source, but as the key, the living, breathing witness who could finally unlock a story he had been forced to abandon. He agreed to a meeting, his voice a low growl of professional interest that barely concealed the scent of blood in the water. The meeting took place in a cramped, cluttered office that smelled of old newsprint and burnt coffee. Books and files were stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. Ben Carter was exactly as his voice had suggested, weary eyes that had seen too much, a rumpled tweed jacket, and a gaze that could strip paint from a wall. He listened to Alara's story with a practiced skepticism, his expression unreadable. He had heard countless stories of victimhood, of corporate injustice. He needed more than emotion. He needed facts, data, a trail to follow. He tested her, asking sharp, technical questions about mining operations, about safety protocols, about the specific geological formations at Blackwood Creek. He was trying to see if she was merely a grieving daughter or a credible expert. Alara met his skepticism head-on, not with anger, but with a flood of precise, irrefutable information. She spoke his language, the language of evidence, and as she detailed the systematic dismantling of safety measures that corresponded directly with Finch's cost-cutting memos, Carter's skepticism slowly, visibly, melted away, replaced by the grim focus of a hunter who has just found the trail of his most elusive prey. Their initial investigation was a frustrating descent into a labyrinth of corporate obfuscation. Finch was a master at hiding his crimes in plain sight, buried under mountains of legalese and financial jargon. They spent weeks poring over public filings, quarterly reports, and old press releases from Finch Global Mining. Every official document was a dead end, a perfectly manicured facade designed to project an image of corporate responsibility while masking a reality of ruthless exploitation. The safety reports from the period of the takeover were all redacted or sealed. The employee records were protected by impenetrable privacy laws. For every step forward they took, it felt as if Finch had anticipated them a decade earlier, laying a trail of legal and bureaucratic traps designed to exhaust and defeat anyone who came looking for the truth. The sheer scale of his protective measures was a testament to the magnitude of the crimes he was hiding. He had built a fortress of paper and ink, and for a while it seemed utterly impenetrable. During those long, frustrating nights, surrounded by stacks of useless documents, Ilara's resolve was tested to its absolute limit. The initial adrenaline of her confrontation with Finch had faded, replaced by the grueling reality of a long, attritional war. Doubt began to creep in, a cold whisper in the back of her mind. What if Finch was too powerful? What if his fortress was simply too strong to breach? In those moments of despair, she would close her eyes and summon the image of her father. She would picture him in his armchair, the hiss of the oxygen machine, a constant reminder of the stakes. She would remember the stories he used to tell, of the mine, of the camaraderie, of the pride in his work, a pride that had been stolen from him and replaced by a slow, suffocating illness. She would remember the fine layer of coal dust that always seemed to cover his clothes, a dust that she now understood was a poison he had been forced to breathe. The anger would return, cold and clear, burning away the doubt. This was not just for her, it was for him. It was for every miner whose name had been reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. The breakthrough came from a single, overlooked name and a thick file of employee termination records that Carter had managed to acquire through a Freedom of Information Act request. Frank Miller. He was listed as the chief safety engineer at the Blackwood Creek mine. His termination date was exactly 2 weeks after Finch Global Mining had finalized its acquisition. The official reason for his dismissal was, quote, gross insubordination and failure to comply with new operational directives. To Carter, it was a footnote. To Ilara, it was a flare in the darkness. She knew what that corporate jargon meant. It meant he had protested. It meant he had warned them. It meant he was a man of conscience who had been silenced. Frank Miller was not a footnote. He was their insider, the ghost in the machine they had been searching for. Finding him became their singular obsession, the linchpin of their entire investigation. He was the one man who had seen the crime being committed and had tried to stop it. The search for Frank Miller was like trying to find a ghost. He had vanished after his termination, leaving no forwarding address, no digital footprint, no trace of his existence. It was clear he was a man who did not want to be found, a man running from a past that haunted him. Carter used his journalistic resources, calling in old favors and running searches through databases not available to the public. They followed a cold trail from a rented apartment in the city to a series of temporary addresses in small, forgotten towns across the Rust Belt. It was a journey into the heart of the world that Finch had helped destroy, a landscape of shuttered factories and hollowed-out communities. Finally, a single lead emerged. A post office box registered under his wife's maiden name in the small, depressed mining town of Carbon Falls, a place not far from the now-sealed entrance of the Blackwood Creek mine itself. It was a place steeped in the very history they were trying to uncover, a town living in the shadow of Finch's greed. Carbon Falls was a town gasping for air. The main street was a collection of boarded-up storefronts and fading murals depicting a proud mining history that now felt like a cruel joke. A fine layer of coal dust, carried on the wind from the slag heaps that loomed over the town like artificial mountains, seemed to cover everything. A constant, gritty reminder of an industry that had given the town its name and then stolen its future. Ilara felt a profound, aching connection to this place. It was the physical manifestation of her father's illness, a community slowly suffocating. They found Frank Miller, living in a small, dilapidated bungalow on the edge of town. The man who answered the door was a shadow of the confident engineer in his old employee file photo. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes were haunted, and he moved with the weary caution of a man who expects a blow to fall at any moment. The ghost they had been hunting was a broken man, terrified of the powerful forces that had crushed his life. At first, Frank refused to speak to them. The moment Carter mentioned the name Alistair Finch, a mask of pure terror descended over his face. He tried to slam the door, his hands trembling. He told them to leave, that they didn't know what they were dealing with, that Finch was not a man, but a force of nature that destroyed everything in its path. He had a family to protect, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He had already lost everything once. He would not risk it again. Carter tried to reason with him, speaking of justice and public interest. But his words were meaningless to a man who had seen firsthand what Finch's version of justice looked like. It was a world of high-priced lawyers and endless litigation designed to bankrupt and silence anyone who dared to stand in his way. Frank was a man who had fought the machine and lost, and the scars of that battle were still fresh, still bleeding. He was not going to fight again. It was Alara who finally broke through his wall of fear. She asked Carter to wait in the car. She stood on the porch, not as an investigator, but as a daughter of the mines. She didn't speak of lawsuits or journalism. She spoke of her father. She described the specific sound of his cough, the way he struggled for breath in the middle of the night. She didn't use Finch's name. Instead, she used the technical jargon of their shared world, speaking of the unacceptable particulate levels in Shaft 7, of the falsified ventilation reports for the eastern coal seam, of the precise moment the company switched from the more expensive water jet dust suppression systems to the cheaper, less effective methods. She was speaking a language only he could understand, the secret dialect of the mine. She was not accusing him of anything. She was validating the fight he had lost, showing him that someone else knew the truth he had been forced to carry alone for all these years. A single tear traced a path through the grime on Frank Miller's cheek. For years, he had been the only one who knew the full extent of the crime. He had been branded a troublemaker, a liar, an incompetent engineer who couldn't adapt to a more efficient way of doing business. His warnings had been ignored, his career destroyed, his name smeared. He had lived in a silent prison of truth, the burden of it slowly crushing him. In Alara, he saw not a threat, but a kindred spirit, someone who understood the precise mechanics of the injustice that had been done. He saw a chance, not for revenge, but for redemption, for the truth to finally be heard. He slumped against the doorframe, the fight finally going out of him, replaced by a profound, weary resignation. He nodded slowly, a gesture of surrender and of alliance. He invited her inside, into the dimly lit house that had been his hiding place, and began to tell her everything. Frank did not have the smoking gun document. Finch's lawyers had made sure he left with nothing, but he had something far more valuable, a perfect, detailed memory of the documents he had been forced to sign, and the ones he had seen. He was a human archive of Finch's crimes. He described a specific set of internal reports, the weekly atmospheric particulate readings cross-referenced with the quarterly geological stability assessments. He explained that standard procedure required that as miners dug deeper into a seam with a higher concentration of silica, the ventilation and dust suppression systems had to be upgraded proportionally. It was a non-negotiable safety law. But Finch, in a memo Frank had seen with his own eyes, had ordered a freeze on all capital expenditures for safety upgrades, citing the need to maximize short-term profitability before a planned corporate restructuring. It was a direct, knowing, and criminal violation that had condemned the miners to breathe poisoned air. He told them where to look. Not in the official safety archives, which he knew would be sanitized, but in the Municipal Planning Office's Geological Survey repository. As part of their mining permit, the company was required to file all geological survey updates with the county. It was a low-level bureaucratic requirement often overlooked. Finch's lawyers would have focused on cleaning the high-profile safety and employee records, but they might have missed the boring, technical geological filings. Frank drew them a map from memory, a detailed schematic of Finch's paper trail. He described the specific file numbers, the date ranges, the exact terminology of the reports they needed to find. It was the key they had been searching for, the one that would unlock the door to Finch's fortress. He was giving them the coordinates to the one weak point in the armor of a Titan. Ben Carter's source was a timid, career archivist in the county records office, a man who believed in the sanctity of public information and harbored a deep dislike for corporate bullies who thought they were above the law. A hushed phone call and a clandestine meeting in a dimly lit alleyway behind the municipal building was all it took. A thick, dusty manila envelope was exchanged, its contents the forgotten history of Finch's greed. Back in Carter's cluttered office, they spread the documents across the large central table. The air was thick with anticipation, the only sound the rustling of old, brittle paper. Ilara's hands moved with a surgeon's precision, her eyes scanning the dense, technical reports. She found the geological surveys from Blackwood Creek, their pages filled with complex charts and chemical analyses that showed a clear, undeniable spike in airborne silica dust in the eastern seam, exactly as Frank had described. Then she found it. Tucked away, misfiled in a folder of mundane topographical maps, was a single-page internal memo, a carbon copy that had clearly been sent to the county by mistake. It was dated 2 days after the geological report that confirmed the toxic dust levels. It was addressed to the mine's operations manager and detailed a corporate-wide freeze on all non-essential capital expenditures. It explicitly listed ventilation system upgrades as a non-essential expense. At the bottom of the page, in a confident, arrogant scrawl that Ilara would recognize anywhere, was a signature, Alistair Finch. It was the smoking gun. It was the irrefutable, undeniable link between the man in the $1,000 suit and the poison in her father's lungs. It was a death sentence, signed in black ink. A profound silence descended upon the small office. The hunt was over. They held in their hands the physical proof of Finch's crime, a piece of paper that could dismantle an empire and send a billionaire to prison. The feeling in the room was not one of triumphant celebration, but of a cold, grim satisfaction. The weight of the discovery was immense, a burden of responsibility to the men whose lives had been destroyed. Ilara looked at the signature, the casual loop of the F, a symbol of the utter indifference with which he had condemned so many. The waitress, the scientist, the investigator, all of her identities converged in that moment into a single, focused point. The strategist. She knew this document was not enough on its own. It could be buried in legal challenges for years. They needed to do more than just expose him. They needed to shatter his world in a single, public, undeniable blow. Her eyes lifted from the page, and her gaze met Carter's and then Davis's, who had joined them in the office. They saw in her eyes not the grief of a victim, but the cold, clear focus of a general on the eve of a decisive battle. "The annual Finch Global Mining Shareholder Meeting," she said, her voice quiet but filled with an authority that left no room for argument. "It's in 3 weeks. In New York. It's his stage, his temple of wealth, the one place on Earth where he feels completely untouchable. That's where we do it." The plan began to form in her mind, a perfectly structured attack. They would use the Van Site discovery to get her in the door, to get her a microphone, to get her in front of the world's financial press. She would start by telling the story of a priceless stone, and then, when the entire world was listening, she would pivot and tell them the story of the men who were treated as more disposable than rocks. The stage was set, the trap was baited, the checkmate was in sight. The grand ballroom of the Omni Berkshire Place Hotel was a cathedral built to the god of capital. Its ceiling soared 3 stories high, adorned with frescoes of industry and progress, while colossal crystal chandeliers dripped light onto a sea of dark, expensive suits. The air was sterile, chilled to a precise temperature, and carried the faint, metallic scent of ambition. On a massive, stage-like dais, Alistair Finch stood behind a sleek, minimalist lectern, a titan addressing his acolytes. Behind him, a screen the size of a small cinema displayed the Finch Global Mining logo over a graph of relentlessly ascending profits. He was in his element, a king in his throne room, his voice a smooth, confident baritone as he painted a glorious picture of future acquisitions and ever-increasing shareholder value. He spoke of assets and liabilities, of maximizing efficiencies, but he never once spoke of people. In his world, they were simply another resource to be managed, another number on a spreadsheet. Into this hermetically sealed world of power, Elara Vance walked, not as a servant, but as a reckoning. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, her simple business attire a stark contrast to the opulence around her, her presence a subtle but profound disruption in the room's carefully calibrated atmosphere. She felt the weight of 1,000 dismissive glances, but they no longer touched her. Inside, she was a fortress of purpose, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm, a war drum counting down the final moments to a battle she had already won. When the floor was opened for the customary question-and-answer session, a series of fawning inquiries about dividend projections and market strategy followed, each one designed to flatter the man on the stage. Finch answered them with a practiced, almost bored, magnanimity. Then, Elara stepped up to a microphone placed in the center aisle. A low murmur rippled through the room as she came into the light. She was not one of them. She was an outsider, an unknown variable in a carefully controlled equation. Finch squinted at her from the stage, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He did not recognize the waitress, only an interruption to his coronation. He gestured for her to speak with an impatient flick of his wrist, the same gesture he had used to dismiss the sommelier at Ethelgard. The condescension was so reflexive he was not even aware of it. Elara took a deep breath, the amplified sound filling the cavernous room. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of anticipation. "My name is Elara Vance," she began, her voice perfectly level, devoid of emotion, carrying the clear, resonant authority of an academic delivering a lecture. "Mr. Finch, you once asked me what someone like me could possibly know about value. I am here to answer your question." A flicker of recognition, followed by a wave of disbelief, washed over Alistair Finch's face. He remembered the restaurant, the girl, the humiliating lecture about the stone. A dark flush began to creep up his neck. He opened his mouth to have her removed, to call security and dismiss her as a madwoman, but she was too fast, her narrative too compelling. She began by telling the story of the Vance site, the dumb rock that was now a certified priceless new gemstone, a discovery that had sent ripples through the geological community. She spoke of its unique properties, its potential value, weaving a tale of hidden beauty and overlooked worth that held the audience of investors and journalists utterly captivated. They leaned forward in their seats, smelling a story, a new asset class, a potential investment. She was speaking their language. But then, with the entire room in the palm of her hand, she executed the pivot she had been planning for weeks. "But the Vance site is not the most valuable thing your company has ever unearthed, Mr. Finch," she said, her eyes locking onto his across the vast ballroom. "Today, I want to talk about a different kind of mineral deposit, the kind that settles in a man's lungs and slowly, painfully, turns them to stone." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The pleasant hum of interest was replaced by a tense, electric silence. The reporters in the press section, who had been lazily taking notes, now sat bolt upright, their pens flying across their notepads, their audio recorders held up like offerings. Elara's voice never wavered. She told them the story of the Blackwood Creek mine. She told them of the men who had worked there for generations, of the pride they took in their work, of the families they supported. And then she told them of the acquisition by Finch Global Mining. With the cold, dispassionate precision of a scientist, she detailed the systematic gutting of safety protocols, the falsification of air quality reports, the deliberate decision to prioritize a 2% increase in quarterly profits over the lives of the men who worked in the dark. She gave them names, she gave them dates. She transformed the abstract concept of cost-cutting into a visceral reality of human suffering, her words painting a devastating picture of corporate malfeasance. Behind her, on the giant screen, the image of the Finch Global logo flickered and was replaced by a high-resolution scan of the internal memo, the one Frank Miller had told them about. The one detailing the freeze on ventilation upgrades. The one with Alistair Finch's signature, now magnified to the size of a car, a stark black-and-white monument to his greed. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. It was a sound of hundreds of people simultaneously realizing they were witnessing the public execution of an empire. The memo was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof that connected the man on the stage directly to the deaths and illnesses of dozens of miners. Alistair Finch stood frozen behind the lectern, his face a ghastly, pale mask. The blood had drained from it completely, leaving only a waxy, translucent sheen of sweat on his forehead. He tried to speak, to deny it, to call it a fabrication, but the words would not come. His throat was a desert. His confident baritone was gone, replaced by a dry, rasping sound, the pathetic squeak of a cornered animal. His hands, which had gestured with such authority only moments before, now gripped the edges of the lectern, his knuckles white, as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing. He looked out at the sea of faces, at his board members who were now refusing to meet his eyes, at the investors who were already on their phones, their fingers flying as they instructed their brokers to sell, sell, sell. He saw not acolytes but judges. His entire world, his carefully constructed reality of power and impunity, was dissolving before his very eyes, shattered by the calm, steady voice of a woman he had dismissed as worthless. The downfall was immediate and absolute. Chaos erupted in the ballroom as reporters surged towards the stage, their questions a barrage of accusations. Security guards, looking confused and uncertain, formed a weak cordon around Finch, who seemed to have shrunk, his expensive suit now hanging on him like a shroud. He was escorted from the stage not as a CEO, but as a suspect, his face a grotesque portrait of disbelief and impotent rage. In the hours that followed, the story exploded across every news network. Finch Global mining stock plummeted into a freefall, erasing billions of dollars of value in a single afternoon. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting and summarily fired him. Federal investigators, armed with the evidence Alara had made public, descended on the corporate headquarters, seizing records and computers. Alistair Finch, the untouchable titan, the master of the universe, was reduced to a common criminal, his name forever synonymous with greed and a callous disregard for human life. He had built his empire on the arrogant belief that some people, like some rocks, were simply dumb and worthless. And in the end, it was that very belief, his fatal underestimation of the woman he had tried to crush, that had brought it all crashing down. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth. The aftermath was not just about the fall of a tyrant, but the rise of a new kind of power. The story of Alara Vance, the brilliant geologist hidden in a waitress's uniform, became a global inspiration. A rival, ethically focused geological firm, whose CEO had been in the audience at the shareholder meeting, reached out to her not with a job offer, but with a proposition. They didn't just want to hire her, they wanted to build a new division around her. The Vance Institute for Ethical Sourcing and Evaluation was founded, a new entity with a singular mission, to ensure that the human and environmental costs of mining were never again ignored. Alara was given a state-of-the-art laboratory, a significant budget, and a team of the brightest minds in the field. She finally had the resources not just to care for her father, but to change the very industry that had tried to destroy them. She moved her father to a private clinic, a place with bright, airy rooms and the best respiratory specialists in the country. The constant, desperate struggle for survival was over, replaced by a quiet, stable peace. The hiss of the oxygen machine was softer now, a background noise in a life that was no longer defined by it. In her new life, Alara found a profound sense of purpose. She traveled the world, not as an invisible servant, but as a respected leader. She developed new technologies for monitoring air quality in mines, created fairer labor standards, and used her unique ability to see the hidden value in things to help small, community-owned mining operations thrive. She never lost the quiet intensity that had served her so well, but it was now tempered with a deep, abiding sense of hope. Sometimes in the quiet of her new office, surrounded by geological maps and mineral samples, she would think back to that night at Ethelgard. She would remember the weight of Finch's contempt, the cold knot of fear in her stomach. She understood now that he had not just insulted her, he had given her a gift. He had reminded her of who she truly was. He had forced her to reclaim the power that had been dormant within her all along. Her journey was a testament to a simple, powerful truth, that true value is not measured in carats or stock prices, but in courage, in dignity, and in the unbreakable human spirit's demand for justice. The most precious gems are not always the ones that glitter. Sometimes, they are the truths buried deep within us, waiting for the right moment to be brought into the light. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.